please join me in welcoming Scott Rasmussen.
Well, thank you, and good evening. I know you want to get to other celebrations as the evening wears on tonight. I was working this afternoon to come up with an absolutely brilliant opening line that would kind of draw you into the comments and would summarize the things that I want you to remember and take out of this presentation. And as I talked to people, what I learned was pretty much they wanted to tell them who's going to win in November. So I'll start with that and then get on to talking about other things. In terms of who's going to win in November, our tracking poll this morning shows Mitt Romney at 47%, Barack Obama at 45%. That's really close. It's not anywhere near a sure thing. I think you have to say right now Mitt Romney is a slight favorite. He has been ahead ever since that last jobs report came out. And one thing that Governor Romney has going for him is that Barack Obama's instincts are totally out of step with where public opinion is today. Every time Barack Obama talks about more government spending or needing the government to drive the economic recovery, he alienates somebody because a majority of Americans believe that when you cut government spending and you cut deficits, it's good for the U.S. economy. By the way, just as one more side note on the election piece, whoever wins this year is going to claim a great mandate for their side. They're going to say the American people have selected our vision for the nation, and we can now move forward with it. And whether Governor Romney or President Obama wins, that statement will be false. This election is going to be like the trench warfare of World War I. That was the war fought to end all wars. And both sides fought it out fiercely. The numbers barely shifted, the trenches barely moved. And all that happened at the end of World War I was they set the stage for an even bigger war 20 years later. Whoever wins in November of this year, whatever happens, is really just setting the stage for the bigger fight that will take place after Election Day. And that's why what you're doing is so very important. It is the communications and the battles and the public opinion shifts that will take place after the election that will determine where America goes. And to give you a sense of that, I just have to tell you, I know you've been to all these programs talking about the importance of new media and social media, and the fact that you're gathered here tells me that you understand that it's important. But I bet everybody in this room underestimates just how much the new media is going to change things. You don't have a clue as to how big the changes that are coming will be. And partly that's because you're talking about new media as a way to run old campaigns. You're talking about ways to get your messaging out. You're talking about ways to get your base out, to reach out to undecided voters. And sometimes people in the world of politics get so wrapped up in the political world that they forget most Americans live in a different world. What's really going to happen is the new media is changing America. It is changing everything about our society. And in the next 10 years, it will fundamentally change the relationship between the American people and their government. The change could go in a number of directions. But again, to give you a sense of scale, if I stood here in 1992 and talked to a group of newspaper executives and talked about how this new day, the internet, was going to change their world, they would have all laughed at it. In fact, in the mid-90s, I went to a bunch of newspapers and I went to some of their associations and I said, I have a great deal for you. I will give you local polling for free. All that you have to do is give me a link. When you publish the story in your online version, which wasn't a very big deal in those days, you just have to put a link into my website. I was told that newspapers would never do that because they were the trusted source of news and they would never send anybody to another website. Didn't work out too well for them over the last 20 years. You now are quite willing to link to my website, and I thank you for that. But you also brought about change in every aspect of the media. And look, this is where it's all about. It's not about a short-term strategy to get a particular message out or to get more Twitter followers than somebody else. We're talking about things that would change America. And in this country, public opinion drives everything else in the political world. The American people are always ahead of their politicians. They always see the changes coming and what needs to happen first. So, what does that look like? Well, try and picture public opinion as a river rather than as something you go to a website to learn. And picture this river during a rainstorm. During the storm, there's all kinds of splashing around on the surface. That's the daily tracking polls. That's the response to what President Obama said yesterday about immigration. These things are fleeting. They do have an impact. But if you go a foot beneath the surface, there is a deep current of public opinion that moves in a steady and constant direction. And that is what moves policy and government in this country. We never see that because when we study history, we study the big moments. So we were all taught that on April 19, 1775, there was a shot heard around the world that started the American Revolution. But that's not really true. The revolution was building for decades before that. Public opinion began to change about the relationship between the colonies and the mother country. There were all kinds of skirmishes, and some of you tried to memorize all the dates of the Stamp Act and the Intolerable Acts and the Boston Massacre and the Boston Tea Party. We don't quite know why the shot heard around the world started the revolution, why that particular moment was the catalyst. But that's all it was. And the other important thing to remember about this, public opinion moved first, then there was a catalyst, and only after that did a politician get involved. Thomas Jefferson wrote the Declaration of Independence 15 months after the war began. It wasn't people rallying to what a political leader said. And Jefferson himself said that all he did was put into words what the American people were feeling. This is America's path to change, and it continues generation after generation. We heard about a story of a young woman who in 1955 refused to give up her seat in a bus in Montgomery, Alabama. And some people say that Rosa Parks started a civil rights revolution. But that's not really true. Public opinion moved first. Her action was a catalyst. And then Martin Luther King put the movement into words. And it's important to note, Dr. King did not say America had to change. What he said was America had to live up to its ideals. The Declaration of Independence. There's two ways that we know that public opinion moved first in the case of the Civil Rights Movement. The first polling showed us that before Congress did anything, the public supported change by a 2-to-1 margin. But there's an even more basic way. It's probably something you don't know about. In 1943, 12 years before Rosa Parks had her famous moment, she did the same thing on a bus in Montgomery, Alabama, and nothing happened. Public opinion wasn't ready. Between 1943 and 1955, a lot of things happened. World War II ended. Black soldiers came back from the war and didn't want to be treated as they had been before that. Young women from the South had gone to colleges up north and seen different things. Some of them helped Rosa Parks along the way. Television came in and began to show a different perspective, show the rest of the nation some of the things that were happening. But the lesson is that the public decided what would happen and the politicians followed. So where's the public today? The last time government spending went down in America from one year to the next was 2 years before I was born. Now, I know that some of you were thinking that must have been the Clinton years. Maybe Reagan. I was actually born when Dwight Eisenhower was president. And the last time that government spending went down in America, Bill Haley of the Comets were topping the charts with Rock Around the Clock. And Elvis Presley recorded his very first single that year. Now, the sad part is, for the 58 years since, voters have voted for presidents and for members of Congress who promised to cut spending and taxes. Every single time. And it's never happened once. That leads to a little bit of voter frustration. And there were lots of steps along the way. Lyndon Johnson and Richard Nixon both implemented policies in the 60s and early 70s that they could promise benefits to voters then and pass off the cost to some future generation. We are that future generation. We are picking up those costs now. But this frustration, while it kept building, didn't really ignite a change until the bailouts of 2008. The financial industry bailouts remain the most hated piece of legislation in modern American history. That's pretty good. I thought some of you would be upset for me saying it's more hated than the president's health care law. It happens to be. On the day that the bailouts were passed, 27% of Americans favored them. Now 25% think they were a good idea. That spun off the Tea Party movement and the Occupy movement. It made a lot of people angry. We have a nation where 4 years ago, 80% of homeowners thought their home was worth more than they paid for it. Now only 49% think their home is more than they paid for it. And this comes at a time when they still look back at those bailouts and say, hey, wait a minute, something went wrong here. People have been trying to figure out what to do and getting more and more frustrated. There is a sense that something has just gone wrong, and what we see in the political environment about this is the recent election patterns. In 2006, 2008, and 2010, voters did the same thing every single year. They voted against the party in power. It wasn't that they loved Republicans one year and Democrats the next. They just wanted to throw out whoever was in charge, because bluntly, they don't think either side has a clue. A majority of Americans today say that Barack Obama has not presented a serious plan for dealing with the deficit in the economy. A majority of Americans say the Republicans in Congress have not presented a serious plan for dealing with the deficit. A majority of Americans believe that if Mitt Romney wins and Republicans win control of the House and Senate, government spending will not go down. There is a fair amount of skepticism and frustration in the environment, and it goes back beyond just those last couple of elections. In 1992, Bill Clinton came out, won the White House, had a majority of Democrats in Congress, and lost control of Congress before he left office. So George Bush came in. He had a majority of Republicans in Congress and lost control of Congress. That has never happened before in American history in back-to-back presidential administrations. And then Barack Obama made it 3 in a row. It is a fundamental rejection of both political parties. And let me put it in real simple terms. I happen to be a proud fan of the New York Football Giants. And when the Dallas Cowboys play the Washington Redskins, I want them both to lose. Intellectually, I know it can't happen, but that's what I'm rooting for. And there's an awful lot of Americans who, when the Republicans play the Democrats, they want them both to lose. That's where we are at this point in time, and that's the environment that you are participating in with the new media. And one of the things that we make a mistake about when we talk about politics is we think everybody is watching the game. That just isn't true. On the night that President Obama gave his big health care speech, to Congress. September 9th, 2009, I went around and looked at the newspaper headlines to see how they were covering it. And the New York Post had a full-page tabloid front cover, big picture, and the headline said, Derek Jeter ties Lou Gehrig for Yankees all-time hit leader. They did not think the president's speech was the biggest story. A lot of people in New York were far more interested in Derek Jeter. If you want to change the country, you need to reach those people. You need to recognize, go to see what's trending on Twitter. It's usually not things that are in the political realm. You need to talk in those terms. And you need to find a way to connect. And when you start to do that, it becomes a real challenge because you want to talk about politics and you want to talk about deregulation and they want to talk about what's going to make life better in America. And if you don't find a way to get a better message out, you're going to lose them. What you also have to recognize, though, is that in this process, the government is not in charge. The government does not run the country. If it's functioning properly, the government plays a nice support role in a self-governing society. But the best way to consider what the government really does is to think of it as a free rider that is just gliding along with whatever society does. The reason government became so powerful and so centralized in the 1960s and 70s is not because of some nefarious plot or some great political skill of somebody who changed American attitudes. It's because of what was happening in society at large. In the late 19th century, cities grew and they needed something different to advertise and reach people, so daily newspapers grew up. And then we went into radio and television, and the news became more centralized. Everybody began to focus on Washington because in those old days they didn't have remote broadcasts. So they set up a few cameras in New York, a few cameras in Washington, and that's where we got our information. It was because the society was moving in that way that government just followed along. In 1941, when Franklin Roosevelt gave a speech on the radio about World War II, the beginning of World War II, there were 130 million people in the country. An estimated 90 million of them listened to the president's speech. When Jimmy Carter was in the White House and gave a speech, everybody in America watched, because those of us who wanted to watch Charlie's Angels had to wait because they wouldn't start until the president's speech was done. You laugh, that's the way it was. It wasn't until the late 80s that television stations would begin to carry something else. Well, now when Barack Obama gives a speech, 37 million people tune in. I mean, that's a big crowd. They're mostly partisan Democrats. When George Bush gave a speech, they were mostly partisan Republicans. So now, instead of a president giving a speech to the nation, you have a party leader giving a speech to his team. It changes the dynamics. And oh, by the way, I'm pretty sure that when President Obama is giving a speech, there are about 200 people in this room offering a simultaneous translation for their audience. That means it's very difficult to get a central message out. It can't work the way it used to. When you start talking about these things, every message that you put out gets sent to a wide variety of sources too. And here's the thing that is hardest to achieve. How do you get credibility? How do you get your message listened to? If you were a politician in the 60s or the 70s, you went to the local newspaper editor, the local radio guys, and the local TV news people. You got on TV, your opponents couldn't get any coverage, and so you dominated the news. But now it doesn't happen. If a young woman gets a message sent to her today by every news organization and every blogger in this room, and she also gets a tweet from a woman that she knows in her mother's morning out group, she will believe that person. She will believe her friend over every source in this room and every source in the media. By the way, I think that's a good thing. What it makes hard is the idea that you're talking about. How do you get a message out about limited government and free markets? Let's start with the fact that nobody in America cares about limited government. They care about the kind of society that limited government creates. People are pragmatic. They want to hear about the results. So when you begin to push a message out, you want to focus on how it impacts life in the real world. And recognize that as it gets sent along through all those tweets and different chains of connections before it reaches an end user, it will get changed a lot, but the tone of it matters at least as much as the content. What you want to have in your message is not saying we want deregulation because it's consistent with our theories of the way free markets should work. You want to be saying, who do you trust more? Consumers making their own choices, or a government regulator who is looking for a job from that company next year? You want to put the choices out there in clear terms so that people understand that your policies and attitudes and ideas are going to give them a better society. It is a tough thing to do, but what you need to also realize is that people are already with you on so many of these points. If we go out and ask 1,000 people, does fill in the blank industry need more regulation, people will say yes. Because they believe every industry needs accountability. If we go out and say, what would do more to hold this industry accountable? More regulation or more free market competition? Competition wins every time, on every issue, on every day of the week. On healthcare, people think free market competition will bring the cost of care down and improve the quality of service. They think government regulation will do the opposite. So we have these attitudes that are out there. You need to be getting messages out to them, but you also have to recognize that there's something else going on. How many people here ever lamented the type of economic education we have in our school systems? There's a little bit of a concern. We don't think people are learning much about economics. You know what the best teacher of free market economics is in the world today? eBay. People are learning how to interact. And when they have those experiences, they change. With this new media world, and with people exchanging information the way they do, there is simply no way a centralized government can survive as it has for the past several decades. The changes that we're going to see in the next decade will bring about the first significant spending cuts. I'm talking real spending cuts, not reducing the growth of spending. The first real spending cuts at the federal level in more than 5 decades. But even more than that, it will be a shift in the attitude of the role of government. And that is something that is going to be painful to achieve. Every time you shift power and money from one group to another, the group losing power and money fights back. Do not believe for a moment that the political class is going to say, you know, public opinion thinks we should be taxing less and regulating less, so we're going to give up our power and money. It will be an ugly, ugly fight. You know, when Captain Parker assembled those Minutemen for the shot heard around the world, he didn't know that's what it was going to be. He got them together a little after midnight. They waited 4 hours, and they started to hear the British coming. They stood across from each other about 5-ish in the morning. The shot got fired, and our history books then say, we won the revolution and lived happily ever after. What really happened was the British were the professionals. They got off the next volley. 18 out of 77 Minutemen were felled by bullets in the first round of the Revolutionary War. And the other 59 didn't think, wow, we just started a great revolution. They thought, man, are we in trouble. They fled to the woods, They realized they picked a fight with the mightiest military power in the world, and it took more than a decade before a constitution was established. I hope there's no shooting, I hope there's no violence in this transition, but it will take a long time. I am very optimistic about the future of America for the simple reason that I believe the American people are ahead of their politicians, and I trust the judgment of the American people far more than I trust any elected politician in America.
Yeah.
I'm also an optimist because I believe the American people have a good sense of what's needed. I've written a book about the ways that the American people would cut federal spending. Some of the things you won't like, but most of it you would. Some of the programs won't be exactly in line with the way the conservative theory says it should be, but the instincts are there. People want to move in a direction that you would be generally comfortable with. And the reason that I get nervous is because I know that things always get worse before they get better. I know it's going to be a difficult transition time. But when all is said and done, 81% of Americans today believe that we are all endowed by our Creator with certain inalienable rights, including the rights to life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness. 77% of Americans believe that a free market economy is better than a government-managed economy. 6 out of 10 believe that when our nation is living up to its ideals, we are the last best hope for mankind. Americans believe in the ideals and the principles that our country was founded upon. Sometimes they don't know how the political debate impacts on those things, but the basic founding ideals have never wavered in the hearts of Americans. What people need to do is what Dr. Martin Luther King did, and find ways to lift up the message to say that what our nation needs to do is to live up to those ideals, through good times and bad, to become the nation that we were supposed to be. And that will resonate with the American people, because more than anything else, when people talk about politics, they're not talking about a checklist of who's right on this issue or who's right on that issue. They're looking for somebody who gets it. They're looking for somebody who can connect. And they're looking for what Abe Lincoln called an advocate for the American people. Someone who can take the views and passions of the public to the halls of government and make the political class surrender. I guess in a simple term, what people are looking for is the same thing they were looking for at the end of the most famous presidential speech of all time. They want our nation to have a new birth of freedom, so that government of the people, and by the people, and for the people, shall not perish from this earth. Thank you very much.